Hello friends, Jane Curcio back with Breaking Bread for You. And in this presentation, we are going to examine part 4 of the series on Abraham, chapters 19 through 21, that will include discussions on the depravity of Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot's rescue from Sodom, the destruction of these two cities, the incestuous conception of Moab and Ammon, the Abraham and Abimelech covenant, the birth of Isaac, and the separation of Hagar and Ishmael from Abraham. Now, in this map is the long-standing location of ancient Sodom that was on a peninsula on the southeast end of the Dead Sea, which is now underwater. And Gomorrah is thought to have been on a smaller peninsula south of Sodom, also now underwater. But there has been another possible location recently uncovered by archaeologists east of the northeast corner of the Dead Sea, Tal al-Hammam. Now, in both locations, sulfur and brimstone deposits have been found in the soil. And to answer why Sodom and Gomorrah were singled out for judgment by God, bear in mind that not only had there been an outcry about their excessive depravity, but they were located well inside the boundaries of the land of promise, merely 40 miles away from either sites, from the future capital of the city of Jerusalem. Remember that during the wilderness period of Israel, under Moses' lead, no sin was tolerated in the camp, since it threatened the presence and protection of God as they made their way to Canaan, represented by the pillar of smoke by day and the pillar of fire by night. And it says in verse 1 of chapter 19, "Now the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face toward the ground." We know that these are the same two angels who accompanied the Lord to visit Abraham and Sarah. And about Lot sitting in the gate, it is an expression for the elders of a city magistrating over legal and business transactions at the central gate of the city hall of the ancient Near East. So in the capacity of a municipal officer, Lot said in verse 2, "Here now, my lords, please turn into your servant's house and spend the night, and wash your feet. Then you may rise early and go on your way." Now, this degree of hospitality was normal in the ancient Near East. In fact, it would be next to criminal not to show strangers hospitality. But the angel said to Lot, "No, but we will spend the night in the open square." But he insisted strongly, so they turned in to him and entered his house. Then he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. Now, I take it that at this point, Lot does not recognize that the two individuals are angels. Neither does it appear that the Sodomites recognize them to be angels, but very attractive men. And in verses 6 and 7, it goes on to say, "So Lot went out to them through the doorway, shut the door behind him, and said, 'Please, my brethren, do not do so wickedly.'" Here, Lot calls them brothers, perhaps in order to reason with them, or, as some suggest, he might have been tainted by living amongst them. If you will recall in our last session when we read God promising that if there were 10 righteous souls in Sodom, he would not destroy the city, and that there were not found 10 righteous souls since God destroyed the city, perhaps even in regard to Lot, his wife, and their strange daughters. After all, nothing is said about Lot being righteous in Genesis, as is stated about Abraham in chapter 15, verse 8. However, in Abraham's plea to God to save the city, even if there were 10 righteous souls there, suggests that he esteemed his nephew Lot to be righteous, but perhaps only in comparison to the wicked Sodomites. And this might be the case with Peter, who said in his second letter, and I quote, "He, God, delivered righteous Lot, who was oppressed by the filthy conduct of the wicked." 2 Peter 2:7. Yet what can be said for certain is that God rescued Lot and his family from Sodom, not because they were righteous, but because of Abraham's righteousness, his position as God's servant, and his desperate plea to God to not destroy the city. And why should we care about Lot's spiritual condition? Well, like righteous Noah being saved by God from the flood, a picture of the church saved in the rapture from the wrath of God in the day of the Lord, Peter uses God's rescue of Lot from Sodom in the context of the coming of the day of the Lord, when the world will be destroyed by fire. 2 Peter 3. More importantly, what we can take away from all of this is not about recognizing Lot's spiritual condition from that of Abraham's, but about the unfathomable mercy of God for delivering the marginally righteous and undeserving from destruction. What we can say about Lot and his family and us. Now, what happens next reveals Lot's lack of character or love for his family, where it says in verse 8, "See now, I have two daughters who have not known a man. Please let me bring them out to you, and you may do to them as you wish. Only do nothing to these men, since this is the reason they have come under my roof." Fortunately for Lot's daughters, the mob had no desire for them. And in verse 9, they shouted, "Stand back." Then they said, "This one," speaking of Lot, "came in to stay here, and he keeps acting as a judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." And here it might be that as a magistrate, Lot had the reputation for judging them. And it goes on to say, "So they pressed hard against the man Lot and came near to break down the door. But the angels, reached out their hands and pulled Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck the men who were at the doorway of the house with blindness, both small and great, so that they became weary trying to find the door." Now, being blinded and continuing to knock down the door indicates just how depraved, even demon possessed, this mob had been. And in verse 12, it begins to say, "Then the men," the angels, "said to Lot, 'Have you anyone else here, son-in-law, your sons, your daughters, and whomever you have in the city? Take them out of this place. For we will destroy this place, because the outcry against them has grown great before the face of the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it.'" So Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law who had married his daughters, and said, "Get up, get out of this place, for the Lord will destroy this city." But to his sons-in-law he seemed to be joking. And it is to ask here, why would they think Lot would joke about such a thing? Had he done so before while drinking? Whatever the case, it begins to say in verse 15, "When the morning dawned, the angels urged Lot to hurry, saying, 'Arise, take your wife and your two daughters who are here, lest you be consumed in the punishment of the city.' And while he lingered, the men took hold of his hand, his wife's hand, and the hands of his two daughters, the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out and set him outside the city." So it is to ask, why is Lot lingering here? Utter destruction is about to fall upon the city, yet he procrastinates. In verse 17 it says, "So it came to pass when they had brought them outside that he said, 'Escape for your life. Do not look behind you, nor stay anywhere in the plain. Escape to the mountains, lest you be destroyed.' Then Lot said to them, 'Please no, my lords. Indeed, now your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have increased your mercy which you have shown me by saving my life. But I cannot escape to the mountains, lest some evil overtake me and I die. See now, the city is near enough to flee to, and it is a little one. Please let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my soul shall live.'" Unbelievably, he's concerned about where he is going to live, and that it not be too far from Sodom. Now, I would think that Lot would want to run to Uncle Abraham, but he doesn't. And in verse 21, the angel said to Lot in verses 21 and 22, "See, I have favored you concerning this thing also, and that I will not overthrow this city for which you have spoken. Hurry, escape there, for I cannot do anything until you arrive there." Therefore, the name of the city was called Zoar, Zoar meaning small or insignificant. And it continues to say in verse 23, the sun had risen upon the earth when Lot entered Zoar. So having left Sodom in the morning and arriving in Zoar the next morning, it took them about 24 hours to reach Zoar. And in verse 24 it says, "Then the Lord rained brimstone and fire on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. So he overthrew those cities, all the plain, all the inhabitants of the cities, and what grew on the ground." This has become the classic image of God's judgment on the wicked in the world, a foretaste of the day of the Lord in Revelation. And then we read that both Abraham and Lot's wife looked at the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, but with very different reasons and effect. Abraham witnesses the destruction and should have as affirmation of what God had shared with him about destroying those wicked cities. Conversely, Lot's wife, who was told not to look back at the destruction, is herself destroyed through a most unexplainable means, where it says in verse 26, "But his wife looked back behind him, and she became a pillar of salt." Now, where it says that his wife looked back behind him, scholars take it that she had attempted to return to Sodom, and that is why she was judged as she was. However, the Hebrew term to look used here is nabat, which is never used for to return in the Old Testament. Strong's Concordance translates nabat as look intently at, consider, regard, have respect for, and by implication, to regard with pleasure, favor, or care. So it is not that she looked back out of curiosity, but due to her attachment to Sodom. And to have been attached to that wicked city may indicate her spiritual condition. This has been sermonized over the centuries to warn believers of the dangers of materialism, holding on too tightly to the things of this world, when God wants us to move forward in his purpose for our lives. In any case, let this stand as a warning that if an angel of the Lord commands you to do something, just do it. Now, it would have been helpful had Moses clarified about Lot's wife turning into a pillar of salt, unless he thought it would be taken for granted that God had judged her in that way for disobeying his angel. Some have proposed that turning into a pillar of salt was symbolic of her becoming hopelessly bitter over having lost all that she had in Sodom. However, she is not mentioned again in the story of Lot and his daughters, which assumes that she had perished. In verse 27, it concludes this episode saying, "And Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord. Then he looked toward Sodom and Gomorrah, and toward all the land of the plain. And he saw, and behold, the smoke of the land which went up like the smoke of a furnace. And it came to pass, when God destroyed the cities of the plain, that God remembered Abraham, and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow, when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had dwelt. Then Lot went up out of Zoar and dwelt in the mountains, and his 2 daughters were with him, for he was afraid to dwell in Zoar." Lot being afraid of living in Zoar suggests that the people in that city were also wicked, and so in not trusting in the assurance that his rescuing angels gave him, he feared God would destroy Zoar as well. Then things continue to degenerate in Lot's life when unimaginable depravity is demonstrated by his daughters. Beginning in verse 30, it says, "And he and his 2 daughters dwelt in a cave. Now the firstborn said to the younger, Our father is old, and there is no man on the earth to come into us, as is the custom of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve the lineage of our father. So they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. It happened on the next day that the firstborn said to the younger, Indeed, I lay with my father last night. Let us make him drink wine tonight also, and you go in and lie with him, that we may preserve the lineage of our father. Then they made their father drink wine that night also, and the younger arose and lay with him, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose." Now, there are 2 problems here, maybe 3. The first is, who rapes their father? Secondly, how could they make their father drink wine, as it is said in verse 33? And thirdly, how could he impregnate them, being so very drunk that he wasn't aware of what had occurred? If this story wasn't in the Bible, I might say that the girls were already pregnant from the men they were betrothed to, which would be a lot more believable. Whatever the case, the result of this incest is revealed in verses 36 through 38. Thus both the daughters of Lot were with child by their father. The firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day. And the younger, she also bore a son and called his name Ben Ammi. He is the father of the people of Ammon to this day. Now the Greek Septuagint clarifies the meanings of the names Moab and Ben Ammi, with the former being, he is of my father, and the latter, the son of my family, inferring that the boys were conceived through incest. And in trying to make sense of all of this, scholars have come up with some theories that might help us to understand why this bizarre episode is included in the story of Abraham. To begin with, since Moses merely reported what happened without condemning Lot's daughters for their incestuous actions, the ancient rabbis have suggested that it had been a clever means of perpetuating Lot's bloodline. Remember, he had no sons. This was also their response to Tamar tricking her father-in-law Judah into impregnating her in order to perpetuate her late husband's bloodline, Genesis 38. Yet the modern consensus is that Lot's daughter's actions were reprehensible, and reporting what had happened was meant to demean Moab's and Ben Ammi's descendants, the Moabites and the Ammonites, by exposing their incestuous origin. Why? Because they refused to help the Israelites during the time of their conquest of Canaan, refusing them bread and water, becoming a constant threat to Israel throughout their history. If you will recall that King Balak of Moab had commissioned Balaam the seer to curse Israel, which he refused to do. Although later, Balaam sent Moabite prostitutes into the camp to seduce the men, in order that God himself would curse his people. The enmity between Moab and Israel was so great that the Moabites who desired to convert to the faith were banned from the congregation and the law, Deuteronomy 23, 2 through 6. But later in Israel's history, God's mercy is extended to the Moabites through the Moabitess Ruth, who through marriage to Boaz became the great-grandmother of King David. And it was during the Babylonian assault on Jerusalem in 586 BC that Moab and Ammon became a refuge for the Jews who would otherwise be taken into exile. And that ends chapter 19. And our story of Abraham continues in chapter 20 that focuses on Abraham's relationship to the nations, where it begins to say in verse 1, And Abraham journeyed from there to the south and dwelt between Kadesh and Shur and stayed in Gerar. Gerar was located in the Philistine region, today south of the Gaza Strip in Israel. And it continues to say in verse 2, now Abraham said of Sarah, his wife, she is my sister. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. Now, you're probably thinking that this is the second time Abraham got into a mess over Sarah with a king. The first time with Pharaoh while in Egypt in chapter 12. And as I explained before about multiple accounts of the same events, they originate from different documentary sources that were eventually combined to form what we have in the Old Testament. At least that's the theory. And not wanting to eliminate one account over another, as all documents were regarded as sacred, they included all the accounts in the canon. This is referred to as the documentary hypothesis, first proposed by 19th century biblical scholar Julius Wellhausen. There is also the supplementary hypothesis that holds to one main document to which fragments of other documents were added, up until the canonization of the Old Testament by the Rabbinical Council of Jamnia in 100 AD. Also, this account of Sarah being taken by a king differs from the first in that the story is not so much about Abraham and Sarah as it is about Abimelech and his encounter with God in his dream. Now, the story continues in verse 3 where it says, but God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, indeed you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife. But Abimelech had not come near her, and he said, Lord, will you slay a righteous nation also? It appears from what Abimelech said to God in his dream that he had heard that he destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah due to their wickedness, inferring that he and his subjects were righteous. And then Abimelech defends himself, saying in verse 5, did he not say to me, she is my sister? And she, even she herself said, he is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and innocent of my hands, I have done this. And God said to him in a dream, yes, I know that you did this in the integrity of your heart, for I also withheld you from sinning against me. Therefore I did not let you touch her. And it was vital that God withheld Abimelech from Sarah, for even one night with him, Sarah, who was at that time fertile, would conceive his child, and that would end her bearing the child of promise for Abraham. Now, therefore, it is said in verse 7, restore the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not restore her, know that you shall surely die, you and all who are yours. So Abimelech rose early in the morning, called all his servants, and told all these things in their hearing, and the men were very much afraid. And Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, what have you done to us? How have I offended you that you have brought on me and on my kingdom a great sin? You have done deeds to me that ought not to be done. Then Abimelech said to Abraham, what did you have in view that you have done this thing? And Abraham said, because I thought surely the fear of God is not in this place, and they will kill me on account of my wife. But indeed she is truly my sister. She is the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. So here is the confirmation that Abraham married his half-sister, which was normative in the culture of the ancient Near East, meant to keep the bloodline pure and wealth in the family. Then Abraham continues to explain to Abimelech, and it came to pass when God caused me to wander from my father's house that I said to her, this is your kindness that you should do for me in every place, wherever we go. Say of me, he is my brother. Then Abimelech took sheep, oxen, and male and female servants and gave them to Abraham. And he restored Sarah his wife to him. And Abimelech said, see, my land is before you. Dwell where it pleases you. Then to Sarah he said, behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Indeed, this vindicates you before all who are with you and before everybody." Thus she was rebuked. So Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and his female servants. Then they bore children, for the Lord had closed up all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. In this episode, it is conveyed that the nations can be righteous and that they can bless God's people as well as they can be blessed by God's people. And that ends chapter 20. And in chapter 21, the subject changes to that of the birth of Isaac, where it says, "And the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had spoken. For Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time of which God has spoken to him." Notice here how the birth of Isaac seems anticlimactic, which it should, taking second place to God's promise of Isaac being fulfilled through him. Now, this is where we recognize that the Bible is not about the characters and their stories, but about the revelation of the nature, character, and plan of God for humanity. And in verse 3, it begins to say, "And Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. Then Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Now Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, 'God has made me laugh, and all who hear will laugh with me.' She also said, 'Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? For I have borne him a son in his old age.' So the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the same day that Isaac was weaned." But then things go terribly wrong for Hagar and Ishmael, where it begins to say in verse 9, "And Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, scoffing." At this time, Ishmael is 13 years old, considered to be the age of accountability, and so his scoffing would not be taken as child's play. And it continues to say in verses 10 and 11, "Therefore she said to Abraham, 'Cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son Isaac.' And the matter was very displeasing in Abraham's sight because of his son." Now, what Sarah meant here was that Ishmael would not be the Bechorah, the child of the birthright and blessing, who would inherit the lion's share of Abraham's estate and succeed him as chieftain. By casting Ishmael out of Abraham's clan, his rights to his father's estate was dissolved. And by casting Hagar out of Abraham's household constituted a divorce and her being freed from slavery. Then God tells Abraham in verses 12 and 13, "Do not let it be displeasing in your sight because of the lad or because of your bondwoman. Whatever Sarah has said to you, listen to her voice, for in Isaac your seed shall be called. Yet I will also make a nation of the son of the bondwoman, because he is your seed." So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water, and putting it on her shoulder, he gave it and the boy to Hagar and sent her away. Then she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. And the water in the skin was used up, and she placed the boy under one of the shrubs. Then she went and sat down across from him at the distance of about a bow shot, for she said to herself, "Let me not see the death of the boy." So she sat opposite him and lifted her voice and wept, and God heard the voice of the lad. Then the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven and said to her, "What ails you, Hagar?" And the angel said, "Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is." Arise, lift up the lad, and hold him with your hand, for I will make him a great nation. Here, God is focusing his attention and speaking his blessing over those who will not be Isaac's descendants, but Ishmael's descendants. And where it continues to say in verses 19 and 21, then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the lad a drink. So God was with the lad, and he grew and dwelt in the wilderness and became an archer. He dwelt in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. And let me say here that the Palestinians I knew in Israel admit that they are of Egyptian descent. And in verses 22, the subject changes back to Abimelech, who cuts a covenant agreement with Abraham. And it came to pass at that time that Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, spoke to Abraham, saying, God is with you in all that you do. Now, therefore, swear to me by God that you will not deal falsely with me, with my offspring, or with my posterity, but that according to the kindness that I have done to you, you will do to me and to the land in which you have dwelt. And Abraham said, I will swear. Then Abraham rebuked Abimelech because of a well of water which Abimelech's servants had seized. And Abimelech said, I do not know who has done this thing. You did not tell me, nor had I heard of it until today. So Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two of them made a covenant. And Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock by themselves. Then Abimelech asked Abraham, what is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs which you have set by themselves? And he said, you will take these 7 ewe lambs from my hand, that they may be my witness that I have dug this well. Therefore he called the place Beersheba, well of 7, or well of oath, or both, because the two of them swore an oath there. Thus they made a covenant at Beersheba. And that covenant assured Abraham that he could live in peace at Beersheba and his son after him, an oasis with ample water. Now, I take it that the story was included in Abraham's narrative to show how he acquired the wells and the land around it, an oasis in a dry area, by purchasing it so that no one could claim that it wasn't his. This would be an important part of Abraham's estate that Isaac would inherit. But I think there is more that Moses was conveying here. In verses 32 and 33 it says, so Abimelech rose with Phicol, the commander of his army, and they returned to the land of the Philistines. Then Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham stayed in the land of the Philistines many days. From this I agree with the consensus that the accentuation of Abraham living in Philistia, outside of the land of promise, Canaan, and where Isaac was born, was to convey that God's promise of the land was not fulfilled in their lifetime. Abraham and Isaac lived in exile amongst the Philistines, who by the grace of God sold him the rights to an oasis, Beersheba, cutting a covenant with him, allowing him to live there in peace and prosperity under the protection of the Philistines. Isaac remained in Philistia, eventually settling in the Gerar Valley there. Jacob moved from there to Haran, then to Shechem, Hebron, and finally to Goshen, Egypt, where he died in the 17th century, also not having received sovereignty of Canaan. And we know that the fulfillment of the promise of the land of Canaan came under the leadership of Joshua in the late 13th century BC. And that ends chapter 21 and session 4. I hope that you will return next week to session 5. It might be the last. And I pray that you are blessed exceedingly as you immerse yourselves in God's Word and that you apply the wisdom therein to your lives.